Chapter 79. The Protection of the Helpless. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 6. No man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge, for he taketh a man's life to pledge. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 6. This is a very important law. It is in a sense related to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 19 and 20, which forbids destroying an enemy's fruit trees because whatever is a man's life, whatever is basic to his continuing existence, must be spared. Beyond a certain limit, we cannot wage war against an enemy. In this text, the reference is to millstones, used by people to prepare their flour for the family's daily bread. These millstones were two, the bottom one stationary and the top one moving over the lower one to grind the grain. The bread was made whole-grained, highly nutritious, and a basic part of a man's diet. The Lord's Prayer speaks of our daily bread and refers to this whole-grained food. To take away the millstones as pledges on a loan was comparable to taking away a man's life. His mainstay in surviving would be gone. Loans made to the poor could not require that the essentials of eating and working be taken from them. This law is an absolute prohibition on loans that would require pledges or pawns that would prevent a man from eating or working. The terms of a loan must not degrade a man nor cripple him. If character is an insufficient security, then nothing else is morally valid. To degrade the needy is strictly forbidden. If it is a charitable loan, then no interest can be charged. In Exodus chapter 22, verses 25 to 27, the law reads, If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as an usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. If thou at all take thy neighbour's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by that the sun goeth down. For that it is his covering only, it is his raiment for his skin, wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass, when he crieth unto me, that I will hear, for I am gracious. This law in Exodus speaks of the Hebrew poor, the covenant people. The law in Deuteronomy makes no such restriction. It can be a loan to a foreigner, but all the same, there can be no demand for a pledge or pawn that endangers his life, health, or security. Very commonly over the centuries, the moneylender has not only specified what he will hold as pawn, but has entered the poor man's house to pick and choose what he will take. God outlaws this practice. In Nehemiah chapter 5, verses 3 and 5, we read that some Jews who became moneylenders seized not only their clients' lands, houses, and children, but also exhibited thereby that they had learned the Babylonian money-lending practices very ably. The whole grain was ground daily, and bread was made and eaten immediately. Very commonly, the bread, besides being the mainstay of the diet, was used to wrap the cheese, olives, and other ingredients of the meal. It was, in effect, the plate and the food. This is a law against oppression. The legitimacy of money-lending is not denied, but the necessity of morality in so doing is stressed. Poverty is a form of weakness, and no man has a right to exploit or to abuse the weak. Here again, we have a law of kindness. God's law rejects the concept of a hard, legal indifference to compassion and mercy. This law is at the same time an aspect of family law. The millstones in a house were used by women, usually two, as they prepared the grain for use. The millstones were a basic part of the family's equipment and life. There are references to violations of this law in various texts. In Job chapter 22, verse 6, Eliphaz accuses Job of violating this law, apparently without any grounds for doing so. Amos chapter 2, verses 6 to 8 describes the evil Israelites and their contemptuous violation of this law. There are references to this law also in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 16, chapter 22, verse 27, and chapter 27, verse 13, but they deal basically with the foolish lender. The demand for a collateral that is unjust is a violation of justice, and God's laws require that justice and mercy prevail in every sphere of life, including the economic realm. We have enjoyed some of the consequences of such laws in the past, and now we are losing them. It is noteworthy that the Greeks and the Romans had similar laws during one stage of their histories. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, it is very bluntly stated that, "If a man will not work, neither should he be fed." Biblical law militates both against a parasitic attempt to exploit charity and any heartless attempt to exploit the poor. The borrower's feelings and needs must both be respected. A man's life is at stake, we're told. The literal reading is, "A man's soul." Power should not be used to humiliate and degrade others, and wealth is a form of power. It's interesting that Jeremiah chapter 25 verse 10 sees the sound of the millstone as comparable to joy, comparable to the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the candle. This was indeed a law for the protection of the poor, but also for the protection of the quality and dignity of life. Jeremiah's reference makes it clear that the sound of the millstones was one of the familiar and loved sounds of family life. It meant not only survival, but also the richness of a family's life. The literal reading, "a man's soul," is clearly indicative of this fact. Statist welfarism may be generous to a family, but it is destructive to its soul. This is the very meaning of this text. We cannot strip a family of its dignity and freedom. The prohibition is total. No man, and by implication no human agency, shall take away the necessities of a man's livelihood. We have a faint trace of this law in modern bankruptcy laws, which allow a man to retain his home when he enters bankruptcy. The origin is clearly in biblical law at 2 points. 1, the limitation on debt to 6 years and no more, and 2, this prohibition on the use of the necessities of life as collateral. This means that they cannot be taken from him. If the millstones cannot be taken, then, by implication, neither can the house. In some of the older Christian cultures, land and homes can only be cash purchases. This prevents the buyer from risking the loss of the family's house. The Scottish version of the millstones, called girn, were in use at least into the late 1800s, and like instruments could be found in Northern Europe in rural areas. To remove the millstone prevented a man from living, and it also made it impossible to repay his debt. Thus, to loan money and require a collateral that made life difficult was a way of eliminating the poor man. We cannot appreciate the significance of this law unless we recognize that, again and again, people in power have wanted the elimination from society of the poor and needy. Various rationales have been used to suggest that the country would be better off without the poor, the homeless, and the drifters. Instead of conversion, this solution is seen as elimination. Rich and poor, capitalists and workers, blacks, whites, and others have been the target of such policies. Our century alone gives us many revolting instances of such, quote, solutions, end quote. This text is against all such beliefs. We cannot treat the poor as nothing. They are made in the image of God, and like us, they need salvation, and they need our covenantal mercies and help. We cannot treat a man's life and welfare as nothing.